Golden rays of the spring sun broke through the high windows of Versailles, illuminating the cradle of the newborn prince. No one could have guessed that this light would be the last the child would see in freedom. On March 27, 1785, in the magnificent Palace of Versailles, Louis Charles, the second son of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, was born. The infant was granted the rare and ancient title of Duke of Normandy, which had not been used at the French court since the 17th century. This event, it seemed, was meant to strengthen the dynasty and give France another future ruler. However, the atmosphere around the Golden Cradle was deceptive. The birth of an heir to the throne in pre-revolutionary France was not so much a family affair as a public act. According to tradition, the first to see the newborn prince were not his parents but numerous courtiers, admitted to the Queen's chambers to witness the birth and prevent any rumours of a switch. Only after this was the infant presented to the people. This ritual, designed to confirm the legitimacy of the future monarch, inadvertently emphasized the deep chasm between the luxury of the court and the sentiments beyond its walls. While Versailles celebrated, the clouds of popular discontent were already gathering in Paris and the provinces, heralding an imminent storm. Louis Charles's early childhood was spent in the seemingly carefree environment of the royal court, amidst games and lessons. But even at this tender age, traits emerged that betrayed an extraordinary nature. Many years later, after the boy's tragic death, the doctor performing the autopsy would note a remarkable fact in his report. In 40 years of practice, I have never seen in a child of this age such a developed brain. This medical testimony, devoid of any political bias, became a bitter epilogue to the story of untapped potential. The golden age of Versailles was coming to an end, and the first 4 years of the little Duke of Normandy's life turned out to be merely a short, sun-drenched prologue to a long and hopeless darkness. For 4-year-old Louis Charles, the year 1789 began with a personal tragedy that became a sinister prologue to a national tragedy. On June 4, amidst the work of the Estates General, his older brother, Dauphin Louis-Joseph, died of tuberculosis. Thus, overnight, the carefree Duke of Normandy became the heir to the throne, the Dauphin of France, taking upon his fragile shoulders the full weight of the fading monarchy. This new title, instead of promising a brilliant future, became a stigma that condemned him to suffering. The revolution, gaining momentum outside the palace walls, no longer distinguished between adults and children in the royal family. The fall of the Bastille, the women's march on Versailles, and the forced move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. The little prince watched all these events with eyes wide with terror. The Golden Cradle was replaced by a gilded cage. The climax came on August 10, 1792. A mob stormed the Tuileries. The royal family, fleeing the fury of the rebels, sought protection in the Legislative Assembly, only to find betrayal there. The monarchy was overthrown, and the former rulers of France became state criminals. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, their children, and the king's sister, Elizabeth, were imprisoned in the grim medieval fortress of the Temple. The road to hell had begun. Paradoxically, according to the testimony of a contemporary, at first the confinement brought the children closer to their parents. However, this too later turned into a psychological trauma. Deprived of power and etiquette, the family members became simply a family, finding comfort in each other in the face of the unknown. However, outside the prison walls, the Dauphin's fate was already becoming a subject of political intrigue. Some historians believe that his own uncle, the Count of Provence, the future Louis XVIII, living in exile, saw his nephew as the main obstacle on his path to the throne. By proclaiming the boy king Louis XVII after the impending execution of his father, he not only challenged the revolutionaries, but also deliberately made the child the main target of their hatred, eliminating a rival by others' hands. The prince hostage was turning into a king martyr, whose crown was woven from thorns. After the execution of Louis XVI in January 1793, the 8-year-old boy, who royalists in exile already called King Louis XVII, became not just a hostage for the revolution, but an ideological project. The child was taken from his mother and handed over for re-education to a man whose task was to erase from the heir's mind the very memory of his origins. This tutor was the shoemaker Antoine, a member of the Commune, and his wife. Thus began the darkest and most psychologically complex period in the Dauphin's life. Simon's mission was to break the future monarch's personality and create from him an exemplary little citizen sans-culotte. The methods of this upbringing were cruel. Simon forced his charge to sing the Marseillaise and other revolutionary anthems, generously giving him cuffs on the head for every mistake. He accustomed the boy to swearing and wine. The pinnacle of this psychological abuse was forcing the child to give monstrous, fabricated testimony of debauchery against his own mother, Marie Antoinette, which was later used to discredit her at her trial. However, the accounts of this time are highly contradictory. While some sources portray Simon as an unscrupulous sadist, others present a more complex picture. There is evidence that the shoemaker was, in his own way, attached to his charge. He bought him toys, flowers, and live birds. The boy himself, perhaps in an attempt to survive or out of a childish attraction to novelty, devoted himself to the new life with considerable enthusiasm, a life free from the constraints of courtly etiquette. This strange and tormented symbiosis came to an abrupt end. On January 3rd, 1794, Simon was removed from his duties. The reason was not his cruelty, but a dry bureaucratic formality, a law forbidding the holding of joint administrative posts. The system that created this monstrous educator removed him without the slightest concern for the child's future fate. For the little king, this meant the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another, even more terrifying one. If the departure of the shoemaker Simon brought the boy relief from daily humiliations, it was only to plunge him into an even deeper abyss of horror. After Simon, the child was not handed over to a new guardian. He was simply thrown into his father's former cell, left in complete and absolute solitude. Thus began the final, most agonizing phase of his life, which historians would call the period of being walled up alive. The revolutionary authorities, it seemed, decided to simply forget his existence, condemning him to a slow and silent death. The conditions of his confinement were monstrous. The windows in the cell were sealed shut, depriving the prisoner of the last glimmer of daylight and fresh air. The door was half-walled up, leaving only a small grill at the bottom through which meagre food was passed silently, without a single word. The 9-year-old child found himself locked in a stone tomb, in complete silence and eternal darkness. He spent more than 6 months in this foul, filthy crypt. The consequences of this isolation were catastrophic. Louis XVII, broken and terrified, completely stopped speaking. His health deteriorated rapidly in the unsanitary conditions, without movement or human contact. His physical and mental degradation reached an extreme point. In the stone tomb where his king-father had once languished, his son was now withering away. Sunlight did not penetrate the sealed windows. The 10-year-old boy, whom his enemy still called Your Majesty, turned into a shadow that had forgotten human speech. Only in May 1795, when the child was already near death, was a renowned physician, Dr. Desault, finally allowed to see him. What he saw shocked the doctor to his core. In his report he left a brutally honest testimony. I found an idiotic child, dying, a victim of the lowest poverty, a completely abandoned creature, debased by the most cruel treatment. This diagnosis was not just a medical conclusion, but an indictment of a system that, in its revolutionary fervor, had turned a child's life into a slow torture in complete darkness. The long agony in the dark cell of the temple came to an end on June 8, 1795. It was officially announced that Louis XVII, at the age of 10 years and 2 months, had died from the effects of tuberculosis and extreme emaciation. However, this death, which occurred far from prying eyes, was shrouded in strange and touching details that immediately became fertile ground for legends. The official version could not silence the questions it itself had raised. The only witnesses to the child's final moments were a few guards. According to them, before he died, the boy who had long been silent suddenly spoke. His last words were like a bright vision breaking through the darkness of illness and solitude. "Do you hear the music? How beautiful! Among the beautiful voices I hear my mother singing." He also uttered a phrase that would forever remain a mystery. "I have something to tell you." But what he wanted to reveal, the world would never know. The secret died with him. Mystical details were added to these accounts. One of the guards, Gomin, later emotionally claimed that at the moment of the child's death, he saw a flock of white birds fly down to the water basin on the tower's roof, a phenomenon he compared to a divine sign. As if in Rheims Cathedral, the little king was crowned by God himself. The harsh reality, however, was recorded in the autopsy report. The medical conclusion was merciless. The child's body bore signs of extreme emaciation, numerous tumours, and scabies. But it was during this procedure that an event occurred which was destined to play a crucial role 2 centuries later. One of the doctors performing the autopsy, a staunch Republican named Philip Jean Pelletan, shaken by the boy's fate, secretly stole his heart, placing it in alcohol. He did this for further study, not suspecting that he was preserving the main key to solving the mystery of the temple prisoner's death. This tiny, embalmed organ would become the main and irrefutable witness in a case that would span centuries. The death in the temple, shrouded in mystery, did not put an end to the story of Louis XVII, but, on the contrary, opened a new, bizarre chapter. Far from everyone believed the official conclusion. Doubts about the authenticity of the deceased child and a thirst for a miracle gave rise to a unique historical phenomenon, an entire army of impostors. Throughout the 19th century, historians counted over 60 official claimants in various corners of Europe and America, each of whom claimed to be the miraculously saved heir to the French throne. The most prominent and convincing of them was Karl Wilhelm Naundorff, a German watchmaker who appeared in 1825. His story was full of contradictions. He spoke French poorly and complained of amnesia, yet he demonstrated an astonishing knowledge of intimate details of the royal family's life at Versailles, which it seemed only the real Louis Charles could have known. His charisma and knowledge were so great that he managed to convince even the Dauphin's old nurse, who recognized him as her charge. Naundorff's case also entered the political arena. The King of the Netherlands, wishing to spite France, officially recognized his rights, giving his claims international weight. The phenomenon of the false Dauphins penetrated public consciousness so deeply that it was even reflected in literature. The great American writer Mark Twain caustically ridiculed such adventurers in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, creating the character of a swindler nicknamed the King, who parodies claimants to a lost throne. The mystery of the surviving king became one of the greatest enigmas of the era, ranking alongside the identities of the false Dmitri and the man in the iron mask. An eloquent testament to this is the historical anecdote about the old lady-in-waiting Zagryazhskaya. Before her death, she told Grand Duke Michael Pavlovich, "I need to ask the Lord God 3 questions. Who was the false Dmitri? Who was the man in the iron mask?" They also say that Louis XVII was taken from the temple and saved. I must ask about that too. This phrase perfectly illustrates how the story of the little prisoner turned into a legend that captivated minds for a whole century. For 2 centuries, an army of impostors, historians, and novelists tried to solve the final mystery of the temple. Legends of an escape multiplied, and the debates never ceased, but the answer to the centuries-old question came not from dusty archives, but from the sterile silence of a scientific laboratory. The key to the truth had been kept all this time in a crystal vial. It was the tiny heart, secretly stolen by Dr. Pelletan during the autopsy in 1795. This silent witness, having survived revolutions and wars, awaited its hour at the turn of the millennium. The scientific breakthrough that generations had awaited occurred in the year 2000. Thanks to the persistence of French historian Philippe Delorme, a complex genetic analysis was initiated. DNA samples extracted from the heart, which had been preserved for over 200 years, were compared with the DNA of living maternal descendants of Marie Antoinette, particularly Anne of Romania. The result, obtained by 2 independent laboratories, was unequivocal and irrefutable. The mitochondrial DNA was a perfect match. Science had put a definitive end to the debate. The boy who died in the prison cell was indeed the son of the executed queen, the true Louis XVII. This discovery allowed for a final symbolic act of historical justice. On June 8, 2004, on the 209th anniversary of the prisoner's death, his heart was solemnly interred in the royal crypt, the Basilica of Saint-Denis. It found peace next to the tombs of his tormented parents and other French monarchs. France, after 2 centuries, officially honoured the memory of its most unfortunate monarch, the king who never saw the sun. The mystery was solved, but the story is not over. The tragic fate of the child martyr left such a deep scar on the national consciousness that even today in France, there are periodic calls to canonize him as a saint. The enigma has been replaced by the sorrowful memory of an innocent victim, crushed by the merciless grindstones of high politics. The story of Louis XVII is not just a chapter in a textbook on the French Revolution, it is a tragedy that has gone far beyond the scope of political chronicles and has become an eternal symbol. The fate of the boy, born in a golden cradle and deceased in a walled-up cell, became one of the darkest and most damning pages of that era. It ruthlessly showed how grand slogans of liberty and equality can turn into unimaginable cruelty, and how all-consuming political passions can grind up and devour defenseless children's lives. The little king became the most innocent and most silent victim of the revolutionary terror, its living reproach. But the significance of his story is much broader. The tale of the king who never saw the sun remains an eternal warning for all subsequent generations. It is a poignant reminder of how ideological obsession, in the name of which the most terrible crimes are committed, turns children into bargaining chips and hostages of adult conflicts. In his person, history showed its most inhuman face, where a child's life is stripped of all value in the face of abstract ideas and the struggle for power. After the autopsy of the mutilated body, the doctor, who was far from having monarchist sympathies, made a dry and therefore even more tragic conclusion. The boy would have grown into a man of outstanding mental qualities. This sentence contains all the bitterness of an irreplaceable loss. History will never know what kind of monarch Louis XVII might have become, what decisions he might have made, and how the fate of his country might have unfolded. Instead, he remains forever in memory as the 10-year-old prisoner of the temple, an eternal question about a lost future, and a symbol of how darkness can swallow the brightest sun.